going to take a closer look at this Naswa region. It covers a large as I briefly mentioned, the reason why the outside world, anything outside of Naswa, is interested in this region primarily is because of oil resources, those energy resources. But internally, one of the areas of strife and will probably become an increasing reason for strife in this region is access to water, especially as the population continues to increase. Now we see how the population is distributed in this region, and you can see clearly that one area that is not very populated are the Sahara Desert and the Arabian Desert, which makes up a large percentage of the overall region. But access to water will continue to be a problem internally, not only for farming and for agriculture, but also just for human usage. But your question is, the relationship between people and water is especially significant in this realm. From the map, explain what source of water accounts for each population cluster. So you can see where the red dots are. That's your population cluster. What is the source of water for each of these areas? And how might these patterns indicate a society's economic and technological development? As was mentioned at the top, this region is no longer referred to as the Middle East. Well, why not? Because, as I mentioned, that was kind of a Eurocentric or European perspective. When certainly China, which is not an insignificant world player, certainly wouldn't call this the Middle East because, well, this region is west of China. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in modern times to refer to it as the Middle East. Do you call it the Arab world? Well, clearly not, because there are several countries that are distinctly not Arab in this region. So do we call it the Islamic world? Well, certainly Islam has a large influence in this region. However, that kind of limits Islam. When actually the largest Muslim state is actually not in this region. It's actually in Southeastern Asia, Indonesia. So that's why this name Islamic world doesn't really fit here, because Islam, while it does have large influence in this region, it also has an influence worldwide that extends beyond this Naswa region. And of course, we also have to keep in mind that it's not the only religion at play. There's also populations of Christians and Jews as well. You'll certainly get a feel for the instability overall in this region. And, what's the reason for the instability? Well, certainly there are religious differences amongst populations. You'll also notice that, much like sub-Saharan Africa, as we've already mentioned, from the colonial era, boundaries quite often were just sort of arbitrarily drawn and have led to tensions between ethnic groups and religious groups that continue to this day. And also, some of these countries have a very, as we saw in an earlier slide, the population is not very evenly dispersed. We have little clusters of population and large areas of relatively uninhabited land. And that leads to lack of communication, difficulty to create infrastructure, which also leads to fractious states. Most scientists think that Homo sapiens, our species, evolved in sub-Saharan Africa anywhere between 100,000 and 250,000 years ago. But as far as civilization goes, that means being able to domesticate animals, to establish agriculture, to build towns and such, that didn't happen until maybe 10,000 years ago. And it turns out that the first civilizations popped up in portions of this Naswa region. So here we see a map of some of the early civilizations, and you notice that there's two different terms. They're hearth and sphere. So what do those mean? What do each of those imply? And what might really be happening on the ground? How do ideas really flow over distances and even oceans? And finally, offer some explanations of what the map's implied flowing cultural ideas might be. I've already mentioned the importance of water and the fact that water will become an increasingly important resource in this region, and it's always been the case. In fact, you'll read in the book about hydraulic civilization theory, essentially the idea that in establishing civilizations, in domesticating animals and establishing agriculture, the successful civilizations were ones that could control the water as a resource for irrigating their crops, and if they could grow more crops, they became more powerful and more influential. As I've mentioned before, a successful civilization is one that can produce enough food to feed itself, and ideally can produce enough that it can use it for trade. The surplus can be used for trade with other groups, and that's becoming increasingly important in today's modern era, where the globe is essentially connected, where you can ship anything almost anywhere. So why do some civilizations kind of fall out of favor or fall apart? Well, sometimes it's because of political strife, but over the long term, some civilizations just have to adapt and shift because of environmental conditions. Where they once were able to produce a lot of food, environmental conditions change, and they have to move on or adapt and create technologies that will allow for the agriculture to continue. So this has been the case in civilizations past, and what's interesting in our modern era of global warming is whether we'll learn any lessons from the past to help us shape the future, because certainly global warming will affect the climate in various regions and cause some areas that are currently productive to become non-productive, but also produce areas that are currently non-productive to become productive. So you would expect to see some civilizations or some countries that are currently powerful become less powerful, and others that are less powerful right now become more powerful due to climate change. This chapter is really a good opportunity for many of us to learn more about Islam. It is a huge, huge force worldwide, and yet not very well understood by many Westerners. So spend time and learn about the different terminologies that are introduced in this chapter. But to sum it up, Islam is a Abrahamic monotheistic religion. It is actually younger than both Judaism and Christianity. And despite its relative youth, it has exploded onto the world scene over the last millennium and a half. Really shows that, again, I mentioned how Islam exploded onto the world scene just in 1,000 years, spread from its birthplace, which was in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad said that he conversed with Allah. Notice how it spread so rapidly and into portions of northern Africa, even as far as the East Indies or Southeast Asia. As we've already mentioned, Indonesia is currently has the largest Muslim population on Earth. Okay, so how has Islam spread its influence? Well, the study of how an idea spreads over space as well as time is something called spatial diffusion. There's no doubt that ideas, and they don't have to be just religious ideas, but ideas do expand their sphere of influence over time. And how does this occur? Well, in some cases, you just have people who convert to the idea. They're exposed to it in a certain population. Maybe only a few people are into the idea at first, but it starts to catch on, becomes more popular. That's called expansion diffusion, where in a fixed population, more and more people start to believe that particular idea or get behind that particular idea. And of course, then some of those true believers can then move and they take that idea with them. And that's called relocation diffusion. and they introduce it to a new population, and then it can expand in that new population. So that is how Islam, and it's not just limited to Islam, can actually be any religious idea or other idea. That's how they spread. Okay, so in that expansion diffusion, you can actually break that down into two different types. There's a contagious diffusion. It's just kind of a person-to-person persuading that the idea has some merit. Then there also can be a hierarchical diffusion, and that's when essentially it becomes mandated that the idea become the word of the land. And it doesn't have to be just from a government. You could even think of some households as being that way, where it becomes a tradition. And if you don't have that same worldview, or if you don't adopt that same idea, there can be social penalties. And so that's another form of essentially hierarchical diffusion. Okay, so rather than just looking at the fixed images that are in the book, I encourage you to check out this animation, which again shows the diffusion of Islam over a span of about 1,000 years, and also offers some insight as to why it has been so successful in its growth. One thing that's important to understand, and this is pointed out on page 346 of your text, is that not only was the religion of Islam successful in growing from its original location, but with it came a lot of Arab culture. So that included advances in science and mathematics and architecture and et cetera, et cetera. So and some of those influences and effects are still viewable in ancient buildings. Now, of course, as Islam spread, it did come into conflict with other religions that were already in place, because recall that Islam is younger than both the Jewish as well as the Christian faiths, and that led to some friction as believers of different stripes came into contact. Pay particular attention to this section on page 347 that describes the difference between Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims. It's something that you probably hear in the news if you follow the news from the Islamic world, but very few people have an appreciation of the difference between the two and how important that distinction can be. This sprawling empire that made great inroads into portions of Europe, only to then cede those same gains as the empire declined. And this waxing and waning of an influence. You have the Ottoman influence into Europe, and then the European influence into what is now our Nazwa, our Middle East region. And of course, caught in the middle are areas like Turkey and a people called the Kurds, who are essentially a stateless nation. They're an ethnic group, a sizable ethnic group that does not have its own areas like Turkey and a people called the Kurds, who are essentially a stateless nation. They're an ethnic group, a sizable ethnic group that does not have its own territory, its own dedicated territory. But it essentially identifies the three regions of vast stores of oil and natural gas. You have one across North Africa, you have one in the Persian Gulf region, and you have one around the Caspian Sea. So we can look at oil as being a resource, just like food is a resource. And regions, as I mentioned, that can produce enough food for themselves as well as even more are powerful. Well, in a similar way, the Nazwa region produces more oil than it consumes. It's got a surplus of this very important resource that is wanted and demanded by other parts of the world that are not as energy rich. And so therefore, this region is very, very crucial as a global trading partner. So once this storehouse of energy was discovered, it immediately put this region on the world stage and made it interdependent, because to a certain extent, many of these countries, while they produce plenty of oil, more than they need, they don't produce enough food, and therefore there's a natural trade setup that's available here. Now, of course, with these, a lot of these countries being relatively conservative and fundamentalist in some cases, the fact that you're going to have, by virtue of trade, interaction and intervention with other countries that don't necessarily have the same beliefs and religious systems, that's going to immediately cause some problems. Okay, with much of the world dependent upon the oil that is produced in the Nazwa region, and of course that oil has to get out of that region and be shipped, and of course it has to be shipped. It's not efficient. It doesn't make sense to try to fly the stuff out of there. You can't build a pipeline from Saudi Arabia all the way to the US. You need to transport using shipping lanes, and of course, as we've seen on the maps, there are some fairly narrow places that the ships have to get through, and so there can be risks of piracy. Any kind of disruption to those shipping lanes would disrupt the energy supply to developed nations, and that would cause all kinds of chaos. So that's why there's so much political interest in keeping peace in the Nazwa region. That talks about essentially the pros and cons of being an oil-rich nation. And first of all, not all the nations in this region are oil-rich, so there's a certain disparity. Some of the oil haves and some of the oil have-nots. And even within a country that is oil-rich, you have a huge disparity between the poor and the rich. You have a huge disparity between the poor and the rich. So the people the oil industry does not produce enough jobs to employ all of the population. There's a relatively small percentage of the population that is involved in the oil trade and therefore benefits from all those revenues. The rest of the folks quite often do live in relative squalor, work in service industries or subsistence agriculture. So another issue is, how long can the boom go on? Eventually, the oil is going to run out. And so the smart nations are those that are rolling some of their proceeds, some of the income from their oil, and diversifying their economy. That's the long game, so that they can continue to be prosperous even after the oil dries up. As we've seen, particularly when we studied South America or when we studied Sub-Saharan Africa, colonial legacy can leave quite an imprint on a region. And the tendency when colonization occurs is to not necessarily try to set up successful governments, but rather to exploit the regions for resources. So in the case of the Nazwa region, obviously the interest of these energy-hungry colonial powers has been to exploit the region for oil and more recently natural gas, not necessarily to establish democracies. And so quite often autocracy has actually been the best way to maintain order. So a lot of these Western nations have essentially set up autocrats as governance in these countries, and that's why democracy initially was not an interest. Now, in more recent times, we have tried to install democracies, but that becomes a problem when there's no real tradition for democracy in this region. Quite often, the infrastructure is not there. Couple that with the strong religious impulses in some of the regions, and you're more likely to wind up with a theocracy rather than a democracy. And when the desire for religious governance is taken to an extreme, you wind up with things like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. These groups seek essentially a theocracy. They seek Sharia law, where civic or civil institutions they want to be governed by religious law as opposed to secular law. essentially it's a desire to return society to a pre-modern time and essentially get rid of all foreign influence. They see the Western world as being bad, and therefore they want to get rid of all foreign influence. Essentially it's a pro and con. It's in this the left box or the left column essentially makes the case for Sharia law theocracy, whereas the right column says that that has not been successful and is not the way forward for a lot of these countries, that a lot of them need to have successful democracies to move on in the modern world. So in recent years, we've seen a clash of these different visions of the future for the Naswa region. Some wanting to be much more conservative, moving toward theocracy, as we've mentioned already with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and others who are exposed to the Western world, particularly through the TV and internet, and think that democracy is the way to go. And this clash really came to a head in what's called the Arab Spring, some of these popular uprisings of 2011 to 2012. Another video that is well worth watching, this talks about essentially the toppling of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and the fact that toppling the dictator is just not enough, and what happens afterward. How does the society move forward? And again, the dual visions of moving toward a political Islam as the way forward, or moving toward a secular democracy. Revolution is by its very definition disruptive. And whether you look at American history, if you think about the American Revolution, following the overthrow of the British rule, there were some people who kind of missed the stability of British rule and wanted to go back to that system. If you look at Russia, there are people who pine for the days of communist rule in the USSR because of a certain amount of stability. And so it will be very interesting to see how the Naswa region, as certain dictatorships topple and new governments form, which direction they go. Especially because a lot of these dictatorships occurred over long periods of time. If you notice on page 357, there's a section called A New Restless Generation, which points out that a lot of the young people, and a lot of these countries have a large population of youth. There's a section called A New Restless Generation, which points out that a lot of the young people, and a lot of these countries have a large population of youth, were only exposed to one leader. And so the question is, what model do they use to go forward? Without the Nile, there would be no Egyptian civilization. The Nile has watered crops for centuries upon centuries, and the flooding of the Nile has been a way of renewing the farmland and bringing new minerals, keeping a certain region rather fertile. And farmers traditionally would essentially depend upon those periodic floods of the Nile to replenish and renew fields. Now it's more of a perennial irrigation. The Nile has been engineered to a certain extent to control flooding, and also to siphon off some of that water for more perennial flooding, for more perennial irrigation, which has allowed more area, more land to be used for farming. One of the problems, of course, is that we all live downstream, so any engineering that occurs and any water that's taken away at one level means less water is available downstream. And this is becoming an issue now for Egypt, as there's usage of water in the Sudan with some of the headwaters of the Nile, dams being built and such, which are affecting the amount of water available, the amount of silt that gets moved downstream into the lower Nile Delta region. We're going to be seeing common themes as we examine these countries individually. But Egypt is really like no other, or similar to many of the others, that is, in the sense that it was ripe for revolution, um, because there's for a long time been a disparity between classes, and an opportunity between classes. And this has become even more extreme as the population, the demographics have changed, and the younger people lack economic opportunities. And that essentially was what allowed the Arab Spring to occur. Okay, so Cairo, Egypt, one of the 20 largest cities in the world. Its population just a shade under 12 million, means that about a seventh of the overall Egyptian population lives in Cairo. In fact, the actual population may be even higher than the estimated 12 million. You'll recall that Hosni Mubarak was forced out of power in early 2011, and that left a bit of a vacuum. Again, because a lot of the country did not have a democratic example. There's no history of democracy. And so the military leaders took control following the toppling of Mubarak. Sudan has recently undergone a civil war and actually divided into a Sudan and a South Sudan. We mentioned that Egypt was ripe for revolution because of years of dictatorial rule as well as a shifting demographic. Sudan was primed for revolution and civil war, partly because of colonial partitioning. The boundaries, the borders drawn for Sudan did not acknowledge the fact that there was major religious differences from the northern part of the country to the southern part of the country. The northern part being primarily Islamic, the southern part being more Christian and African religions. But also in recent years, there's been a difference in the prosperity and economy of the two ends of the country, as oil has been a big player in the southern part of Sudan, which now has become South Sudan. In the next section we're looking at is what's called the Maghreb. And you can see the Maghreb is essentially northwestern Africa, which is primarily made up of some small coastal states and then two larger, very deserty states, Algeria and Libya. And what you'll notice is that most of the folks who live in this region live right along the coast. And that's what facilitate settlement means, is that most people are living there. Now why? What is facilitating the settlement? Why are most people living there? It has to do with topography. It has to do with the fact that you've got this range of mountains called the Atlas Mountains that kind of line up from southwest to northeast. And you have moisture coming in off the Atlantic as well as off the Caribbean. And that moisture is forced up the slopes of the Atlas Mountains, what's called the windward side. And that's where most of the rain falls. Most of the rain falls on the windward side as the moist air is being pushed up. When air gets pushed up, it cools, and then the water vapor condenses into clouds. The clouds produce rain, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have a lot of rain on the windward side of the Atlas Mountains and not much moisture left then when that air continues on the leeward side. As it goes down the slopes and actually warms up, becomes less humid, and therefore you have essentially a desert on the leeward side of the Atlas Mountains. So that's what this whole graphic is getting at. Notice they mentioned intermontane valleys. Again, this is just kind of or intermontane basins. This is intermontane between mountains. So essentially you do have little valley areas even within the Atlas Mountains, and those typically are good places for agriculture because they're flat, but yet they do receive rainfall. Obviously the foothills on the windward side you can tell by the positioning of the Maghreb that it's not that far from Europe. In fact, there you see the Straits of Gibraltar, there's Spain, Here's Sicily. Here's Malta, a little island out here, Malta in the Mediterranean. So not that far from Europe. So clearly there's a lot of connection between Europe and this part of Africa. And so a lot of settlement occurred, as is described in the book. Commerce was largely brought in and perhaps dominated by Europeans, as well as agriculture. So notice, the type of crops that are grown in this region are largely driven by European tastes. So the first two countries in the Maghreb we'll explore are Morocco and Algeria, and as well as Western Sahara. Morocco, many folks probably just associate with Casablanca, one of its largest cities. Of course, that's a Humphrey Bogart famous film. Morocco, as is mentioned in the book, has essentially resisted revolution. Amazingly, it's a very conservative kingdom, and yet it hasn't had the same kind of revolutions that have marked the Arab Spring in other countries in this region. Algeria, its neighbor, agriculturally strong, but its economy is now being driven more on oil and gas reserves. And despite that, the economy is not strong enough because millions have migrated to France in recent years. Okay, so Tunisia is the smallest of these Maghreb countries and actually the most progressive in many, many ways. It tends to lead a lot of this region, at least, in urbanization and different social indicators. However, this was the heart and the start of the Jasmine Revolution. Essentially, the Arab Spring got its foothold here in Tunisia back in 2011. Like Algeria, Libya derives most of its economic power from its oil and gas reserves. Now, Libya had been ruled for decades by Muammar Gaddafi, and as the book describes, in 2011, as with the Arab Spring that was sweeping across other portions of this region, Gaddafi got swept up as well and was killed in 2011, largely because of rebel forces that were supported by NATO forces. It should be noted that a recurring theme we're going to find is that despite the Arab Spring, despite the fact that there was uprisings in many of these countries, the uprising, which quite often got rid of dictators or corrupt governments, essentially just left a power vacuum, which has been filled by either military coups in some cases or other corrupt governments, or equally conservative governments have moved in. So whether there has been great progress toward democracy in a lot of these countries is kind of up in the air. The Arab Spring, which is many people hoped would bring all kinds of freedoms and democratization, quite often it has not wound up achieving those goals. So moving on to Saharan Africa. Now this is essentially moving south of the Maghreb. Some of these relatively small countries, Mauritania and Mali. One thing that's very interesting about Mauritania is that it still has modern day toleration of slavery. It was apparently banned in 1981, but still goes on in some locations. Your book points out that Niger is goldfish shaped, which I had never actually noticed before. And this really is kind of linked back to the fact that when these countries were set up in the European colonial era, none were ever thought to ever have a hope of having independent status. And so the boundaries were essentially laid out very arbitrarily. As your book notes, for better or worse, the term Middle East, this term that designates this region, is Eurocentric in the sense that depending on the distance from Europe, that was the way different regions were described. So you have the Far East, such as China, which is far east of Europe. Similarly, the Middle East region is not quite as far away from Europe, but it is to the east of Europe. So even though it's a slightly misleading term in the sense that the Middle East is not east of all locations. In fact, the Middle East is west of, say, China. We're kind of stuck with it, and it's so entrenched in the parlance that it has pretty much stuck. So in order to describe this particular region, it's typically referred to as the Middle East. Okay, so here we see the 5 states that make up the Middle East. We have Syria, which has a water boundary on the Mediterranean. We've got Jordan. Well, I should mention Lebanon, of course, also on the Mediterranean. Jordan has just a sliver there, right there on the Gulf of Aqaba, which then leads out to the Red Sea. Israel, obviously, has a border on the Gulf of Aqaba as well as on the Mediterranean. And then Iraq, largely landlocked, with the exception of this one little sliver there on the Persian Gulf. And notice the location of Kuwait. Technically, I guess not part of this Middle East region, but this is what started the whole Iraq war back, at least the first part of the Iraq war back in the 90s was when Iraq invaded Kuwait, tried to annex it in order to give it a larger hold on the Persian Gulf. Pretty much shows the different cultural and religious makeup of Iraq. For the most part, the southern part is Shia dominated, and the Shias are kind of aligned with most of Iranians. You have the Sunni Muslims in the northern part of the country, and in the northeastern part of the country you actually have a significant population of Kurds. Of course, there's a lot more Kurds in Turkey as well as in portions of western Iran. So this is kind of the cultural makeup of the Iraqi population. Okay, in 2003, the U.S. and other allies invaded Iraq largely on the grounds of intelligence of weapons of mass destruction. That turns out that that intelligence was very, very faulty. There were no weapons of mass destruction ever discovered. And the other motive was to depose the leader, Saddam Hussein, in Iraq, essentially topple over that government. And the problem has been that it's been a struggle to create a stable government following that overthrow. The U.S. combat role ended in 2010. Okay, so Syria is also a crucible of conflict in the Middle East. Now in Iraq, if you notice in your book, the Shiites have typically dominated the government, and they're also in the majority, despite the fact there is a large Sunni minority. The Shiites, the ruling group, is actually in the majority. The unusual thing about Syria is that a minority population rules the government over a majority. So a minority Shia government rules over a Sunni majority in the country, and that is kind of a recipe for unrest. As the book points out, Jordan has a lot at stake in the relationship between Israel and Palestinians, because the population of Jordan is largely Muslim, largely Palestinian, and it also borders Israel. Now, Jordan is also described as being quite economically challenged. It doesn't have a whole lot of oil, and has a very, very small outlet to the sea through the Gulf of Aqaba, but for the most part has really required foreign aid and investment to keep it afloat. Lebanon is described as having a lot of potential in the sense that it is oil rich. It's got a lot of agriculture, but it's also had a lot of instability over time, and that instability in recent years has largely been due to the fact that it's neighboring or it's bordering Syria, and the unrest in Syria has kind of spilled over. Refugees have become an issue for Lebanon. Okay, so as you've already sort of figured out, much of the unrest in this part of the world is due to religion. Either different sects of the same religion, as we've already discussed in Iraq and Syria, where you have mostly Muslim populations, but even so, divisions between sects of that same religion causes friction. But in the case of Israel, now that's a Jewish state that was created in 1948 in the center of the Arab world. And you see on this map, the orange is the original territory of Israel that was laid out, established by the UN. And then what you see is the green areas are areas that Israel gained in 1949, and the yellow are areas that were occupied by Israel after 1967. You'll also notice in the closer view a lot of blue triangles, which are Israeli settlements. And if you follow the Israel-Palestinian peace process, or lack thereof, quite often you will hear the term Israeli settlements, which again you see quite a bit there in the Golan Heights. As is pointed out in your book, Israel is relatively small in the grand scheme of things. It's the size of Massachusetts, has a population of 8.2 million, and that includes 1.7 million Arab citizens. So it's relatively small population as well. But because of its location, it's got a powerful military, it's a nuclear power, and it's got a lot of international links. So Israel is a big player on the world stage, despite its relatively diminutive status population-wise and territory-wise. In order to become familiar with the complexities of the Israeli and Palestinian political situation, you really have to become familiar with these different terms. Quite often you'll hear terms such as West Bank, Golan Heights. You'll hear about the Gaza Strip. Obviously, you'll hear about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city of many religions, or the home to several religions. And as we've already discussed, religion is such an important part of this particular region, and is the reason for a lot of conflict in this region. Peace in the Middle East is not likely to come anytime soon, at least certainly not in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as there are ongoing issues and most likely going to be additional issues arising due to new gas fields that are being discovered and exploited off in the Mediterranean coast. As we move south of the Middle East region, we find the Arabian Peninsula, and it truly is a peninsula. Notice that a peninsula is an area of land bounded on three sides by water, and that's what we have here. The Arabian Peninsula to the west is bounded by the Red Sea, and to the south is bounded by the Arabian Sea, and to the east is bounded by the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And of that Arabian Peninsula, obviously Saudi Arabia makes up the largest percentage of that landmass. Saudi Arabia must and is planning for the future. As your book mentions, Saudi Arabia has a very rapid population growth, and it has existing disparities in income between the rich and the poor, as well as a large problem with unemployment, which could only become worse with more and more people getting into the job market. So one thing that Saudi Arabia has on its side is the fact that it's got a lot of oil revenue from which and using which they can invest in new industries to diversify the economy rather than making it so dependent on oil and gas. One problem for Saudi Arabia with this population growth, continuing development, will be water and access to clean water. Okay, so the remaining states on the Arabian Peninsula are relatively minor. They are all monarchies in the Islamic tradition. One thing I didn't mention was that, obviously in Saudi Arabia there are many human rights issues. Women are not allowed to drive, for example, and much is the same in these remaining states: Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Yemen. All these places, for the most part, their economies are oil-based. The religion is Islam, and they've had varying amounts of Arab Spring events going on in this region, but a lot of these have been quelled. As always, I strongly encourage you to go through these animations. This is an interesting one because it'll test your knowledge of the entire NASWA region. It'll talk about the geography, making sure you know the bodies of water as well as the countries in both North Africa as well as Southwest Asia. It'll also give you an idea as to the amount of oil production. It's not uniform across the entire region. We think about this whole region as being oil rich, but that's not the case. And so you'll get a chance to pick out which countries are the oil rich ones. Okay, so now we move on. Now that we're out of the Arabian Peninsula, we move into what are called the Empire States. Now, not to be confused with New York State, called the Empire State. These are the states that are known for some of the biggest empires in human civilization, the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire. Of course, with the Ottoman Empire, we're talking about Turkey. With the Persian Empire, we're talking about Iran. Okay, so while Turkey's political capital is Ankara, its greatest city is almost inarguably Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, but this is a very rich city, culturally diverse, really the crossroad, located at a crossroads where the Black Sea meets the Mediterranean, where Asia meets Europe, and I encourage you to read the box on it on page 388 of your textbook. Some of the big challenges for Turkey, obviously the dealing with the Kurdish population in the eastern part of the country, as well as, of course, the fact that Turkey borders Syria, and the instability in Syria, the refugees from Syria have become a major issue for Turkish politics. We talked about EU membership and whether Turkey would ever become a member of the EU, and we revisit that topic. To a certain extent, some of the obstacles are some of the human rights issues in Turkey, and to a certain extent, some of the some Turkish politicians and members of the public are less interested in joining the EU now that Brexit has occurred and there's more instability in the EU. There's some question as to whether there's that much benefit for Turkey to join the EU. Iran occupies a critical position in this turbulent realm. It controls the entire corridor between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. To the west, it adjoins Turkey and Iraq. So notice there's your western border. Both of those are historic enemies. To the north, and to the west of the Caspian Sea, Iran borders both Azerbaijan and Armenia, where once again Islam confronts Christianity. So these are Christian nations, these are Islamic nations, and so that's always going to cause some conflict. To the east, Iran meets Afghanistan and Pakistan. So here's Afghanistan, down here's Pakistan. Both of those are countries with a long history of conflict, as well as a more recent history of supporting terrorist organizations. And to the northeast lies similarly volatile Turkmenistan. So you can see that the country of Iran is essentially surrounded by conflict. But it's got a very important location because it's got a lot of frontage on the Caspian Sea. It's got a lot of frontage on the Persian Gulf. It controls the Straits of Hormuz. So it is just a huge, huge player. And of course, not to mention the fact you see all this red on the map. These are all the oil fields. So even though its reserves are not as big as those of Saudi Arabia, it is a significant player on the world petroleum market. Despite the reserves of oil in Iran, Iran has not been able to turn all that natural resource wealth into economic prosperity, especially across the board. It's got a large population, and the proceeds from all the oil have not been able to trickle down to the average Iranian. So the economy is very much in a mess, partly because of corruption and problems within the government, but also, of course, a long war with Iraq left the country worse than it was before the war. And of course, also its nuclear ambitions have caused international sanctions to cripple the economy as well. Turkestan is the collective term for the 6 states that make up Central Asia: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. So these are all the Stan countries. All of these, with the exception of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was independent, but during the days of the Soviet Union, the other 5 were part of the Soviet Union. And during that time period, of course, the Russian government, the Soviet government, tried to downplay the role of religion in these Central Asian countries. Since the fall of the USSR, and since these have now become independent nations, Islam is making a quick resurgence in these regions. Now, of course, these are all very fractured nations. Notice that the last slide mentioned about the ethno-linguistic issues. This just kind of gives you an idea as to the different languages spoken, the different cultures that are living very, very close to each other in a relatively small region of the world. So still plenty of seeds for conflict in Central Asia. Mentioning that mosques that had been damaged under Soviet control are being repaired and revived. Islamic dress, again, is part of the cultural landscape. National leaders make high-profile visits to Mecca. Most are sworn into office with a hand on the Quran. All of Central Asia's countries now observe Islamic holidays. It mentions that democratic government in this setting is going to be an elusive goal. Things appear to be turning away from freedom and democracy and more toward theocracy in this part of the world. The next section takes a closer look at each of these individual countries that make up Turkestan. So Kazakhstan is the first one that's mentioned. This is the one that's to the farthest to the north. It is the biggest, and during the Soviet rule, of course, it had major railroads and infrastructure that were built in Kazakhstan. So that certainly is a plus. It is perhaps on the upswing as it's leading an energy boom in Central Asia. It's one of the top producers of uranium, as well as one of the top 20 oil-producing countries. Uzbekistan is kind of in the middle of Turkestan, and one thing that's mentioned is the Aral Sea is in Uzbekistan, which is a fraction of its former self, as a lot of its water had been diverted under Soviet rule for irrigation purposes. And it should be mentioned that all of these states in Turkestan got their names during the Soviet rule. During the time period when the USSR ruled this region, it created 5 Soviet socialist republics named after the majority peoples within their borders. And that's where these different names come from. So obviously in Turkmenistan, the Turks are the majority group. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Afghanistan, similarly, those are the populations that make up the majority. I strongly encourage you to watch this video about Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been a war-torn country in modern times. It's well known for its war with the Russians in 1979, and that turmoil has continued on for now currently in the war against terror. The U.S. and other allied nations have been at war in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan, due to its location, has been historically a war-torn country. And this is a very moving video showing the collateral damage of war, which is refugees. And so this is a refugee camp visited by Sebastian Junger. You may be familiar with his work, The Perfect Storm. So he's a reporter, as well as there's a photographer named Reza who visits a refugee camp in northeastern Afghanistan. It's really important to understand the roots of these terrorist groups that are such a big player on the world stage, and what got the country of Afghanistan to this point. Remember, we just said that Afghanistan has been constantly war weary, and eventually the population in those kind of countries just wants some sort of security. And sometimes these groups rise up in those kind of vacuums where there doesn't seem to be any law, any rule. So in fact, I'll read from the book. It says in 1994, what at first seemed to be just another warring faction appeared on the scene, the Taliban, seekers of religion, from religious schools called madrasas in Pakistan. Their avowed aim, that's what they planned to do, was to end Afghanistan's chronic factionalism and endemic corruption by instituting strict Islamic law. And again, popular support in the war-weary country, especially among the Pashtuns, led to a series of successes, and by 1996 the Taliban had taken Kabul. The Taliban's imposition of strict Islamic Sharia law was so uncompromising and severe that Islamic as well as non-Islamic countries objected. Restrictions on the activities of women ended their professional education, employment, and freedom of movement, and had a devastating impact on children as well. Public amputations and stonings enforced the Taliban's code. All too often, promises of security wind up resulting in losses of freedoms. And that is a perfect case that we've seen in Afghanistan. A couple of questions for you to think about. The location of oil is not uniform in this realm. So what are some of the positive impacts of the presence of oil? And what are some of the negative impacts of the presence of oil? Also think about this one. Give several ways that the influence of Islam differs throughout this realm. And finally, where are the cultural hearths of this region located? What is significant about these hearth regions today?